Hey everyone, welcome back. Before you get too comfortable tonight, I need to warn you about something. What I'm about to tell you, it's going to change how you think about justice, about women, about the price of freedom. So dim those lights, settle in, and prepare yourself. Because the story of what they did to female pirates isn't just history. It's a horror story that actually happened. But before we sail into these dark waters together, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments below. I love seeing our global crew gather from every corner of the world. Whether you're listening at midnight while storms rage outside your window, during your morning commute as you brave another day, or while the sun sets over your harbor, there's something beautifully haunting about all of us sharing these forbidden histories together across time zones. It's always fascinating to see who's brave enough to dive into these bloody seas with me, to explore the stories they tried to bury beneath the waves. Now let's set sail for tonight's tale of women who dared to live free and the empire that made them pay in blood. She stood on the deck of her ship, cutlass gleaming in the Caribbean sun, commanding 40 hardened men who'd kill for her without question. But in 3 months, she'd be hanging from a rope, her body convulsing in what they called the Marshal's Dance, while crowds of children cheered. Her crime? Being born female and daring to live free. You see, when female pirates were captured, they didn't just face the law. They faced something far more twisted, a justice system that believed women who chose violence were abominations against God and nature. And what they did to punish this transgression? Well, let me tell you what really happened when the most dangerous women in history finally got caught. Because the truth is, they didn't just want these women dead. They wanted them broken, humiliated, and erased. They wanted their pain to echo as a warning to every other woman who might dare to dream of freedom. Are you ready to hear what that looked like? Picture the morning Bonny woke up for the last time as a free woman. October 1720, Jamaica, blood-red sunrise. She'd been living as a pirate for months now, abandoned her husband, taken Jack as her lover, discovered she had an appetite for violence that terrified even seasoned sailors. When boarding parties attacked merchant ships, Anne would be first across the gap, screaming like a banshee, her blade finding throats before victims knew they were under attack. But she wasn't alone in her bloodthirst. Fighting beside her was Mary Red, another woman disguised as a man. 2 women pirates on the same ship. Imagine how that must have felt. Like finding your sister in hell. Mary's story, even more remarkable. She'd been dressing as a man since childhood. First to claim an inheritance, then to serve in the military. Finally, to escape poverty by turning to piracy. She was a master swordswoman, quick with blade and pistol, absolutely merciless in combat. Together, Anne and Mary represented something that struck terror into the hearts of every official in the Caribbean. Women who had completely rejected their assigned roles. They weren't wives, weren't mothers, weren't even prostitutes. The only roles typically available to fallen women. They were warriors. The world was about to make them pay for it. The attack came at dawn. Captain Jonathan Barnett, commanding a sloop commissioned by Jamaica's governor, had been hunting Calico Jack for weeks. He'd heard stories about the women pirates. Frankly, he didn't believe them. Women fighting as pirates? Impossible. They had to be camp followers, prostitutes. At most, women forced into service against their will. He was about to get a very bloody education. When Barnett's crew boarded Jack's ship, They expected to find pirates below deck nursing hangovers. Instead, they found themselves face to face with two of the most vicious fighters in the Caribbean. While Calico Jack's crew stumbled around in drunken confusion, Anne and Mary stood their ground. Anne fought like a demon, her cutlass singing through the air as she tried to rally the men around her. "Fight like men!" she screamed at the cowering pirates. "Show them what real courage looks like." Too late. Jack and his crew were too drunk, too surprised, too demoralized. Mary, meanwhile, was cutting her way toward the ship's magazine. She'd rather blow them all to kingdom come than surrender. Better death in an explosion than hanging from a rope. But there were too many attackers. Eventually, both women were overwhelmed. As iron shackles clicked around their wrists, Anne looked at Jack with pure contempt. The man she'd risked everything for had surrendered without a real fight. In that moment, she must have realized her fate was sealed, not just by capture, by trusting her life to men who folded the moment things got difficult. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. The two deadliest fighters on the ship, women, the ones showing the most courage, the most defiance, the most honor, women. Yet they were the ones society would punish most severely for stepping outside their prescribed roles. As they were hauled aboard Barnett's ship, both women knew what awaited them. They'd heard the stories, trials, executions, public spectacles. But I wonder if they truly understood how much worse it would be for them. Simply because they were women who dared to fight like men. Wait, what's that? You think this is just about piracy? You're wrong, dead wrong. This was about power, about control, about making sure half the human race understood that certain dreams, certain freedoms, certain forms of self-determination were simply not available to them. The trap had closed. The real horror was about to begin. November 16th, 1720. Spanish town, Jamaica. Court of Vice Admiralty. But calling it a trial is laughable. This was theater, carefully choreographed to reinforce social order while providing entertainment for the masses. Picture a sweltering courtroom packed with sweating colonists, all craning their necks to get a look at the notorious female pirates. The air thick with tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, and rum. Outside, vendors selling meat pies and ale to crowds who couldn't get inside. This isn't justice. It's a carnival. The women are the main attraction. Judge Sir Nicholas Laws sits behind his mahogany desk like a king on his throne. He's already decided the outcome. The trial is just paperwork with pageantry, but he's particularly interested in these two women. They represent something that terrifies him and every other man in society. The possibility that women might reject their assigned roles entirely. Think about it. In 1720, a woman's value was measured entirely by her relationship to men. Daughter, wife, mother, widow, never just herself. Anne and Mary had blown up that entire system. They'd chosen violence over marriage, freedom over security, adventure over domesticity. They'd proven women could be just as ruthless, just as brave, just as dangerous as any man. Intolerable. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Piracy was a capital offense. Both women had clearly committed it. Witness after witness testified to their presence during raids, their participation in combat, their leadership within the crew. But what's fascinating? How the witnesses struggled to describe them. One merchant captain, testifying about an attack on his vessel, kept referring to the women as if the word itself was foreign. The women, he stammered, they fought like... He couldn't finish the sentence. How do you describe women behaving in ways that don't fit your understanding of what women are supposed to be? Another witness testified that Mary Reed had once challenged a man to a duel to protect another crew member. She'd won it, killed her opponent with a single thrust of her sword. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A woman dueling. A woman killing in single combat. It was like hearing the sun had risen in the west. But here's where it gets twisted. The prosecution spent almost as much time focusing on the women's appearance and behavior as on their actual crimes. They described Anne's unnaturally bold demeanor, her masculine dress, her unfeminine language. They noted Mary's ability to pass as a man and her unnatural skill with weapons. See what they were doing? They weren't just prosecuting piracy. They were prosecuting gender transgression, making it clear these women weren't just criminals, they were abominations. Monsters who had violated the natural order by refusing to be properly feminine. The defense had almost nothing to work with. In British maritime law, piracy was a crime with very few mitigating circumstances. You either committed it or you didn't. But the defense attorney tried one interesting approach. He argued the women had been seduced into piracy by the men around them. Clever legal strategy. If the women could be portrayed as victims rather than perpetrators, as weak creatures led astray by stronger male influences, perhaps the court might show mercy. It played into existing stereotypes about female nature, that women were naturally passive, easily influenced, incapable of independent moral reasoning. It backfired spectacularly. Everyone in that courtroom had heard the testimony. They knew these women hadn't been passive victims. They'd been leaders, fighters, decision-makers. Anne had been urging the men to fight harder. Mary had been dueling to protect her crewmates. The attempt to portray them as helpless victims only highlighted how completely they'd rejected traditional feminine roles. That made their transgression even more threatening. Judge Laws wasn't fooled for a moment. When he pronounced sentence, his words dripped with contempt. You, Anne Bonny and Mary Reed, have been found guilty of the charges of piracy, robbery, and felony committed upon the high seas. You shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead. Dead, dead. And may God have mercy upon your souls. Then came the moment that would save their lives, at least temporarily. Both women stood up in the dock. In voices that carried across the silent courtroom, they spoke words that would echo through history. My lord, we plead our bellies. The courtroom exploded. Spectators leaped to their feet, shouting and arguing. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Pleading the belly, claiming pregnancy, was one of the few legal protections available to women in the 18th century. English law held that it was murder to execute a pregnant woman because you'd be killing an innocent child. So pregnant women could have their executions delayed until after they gave birth. Temporary reprieve, not a pardon. But it was something. The irony is bitter, isn't it? The only thing that could save these women from immediate execution was the one traditionally feminine role they'd spent their lives rejecting: motherhood. They'd refused to be wives, daughters, or dutiful women. But pregnancy, the biological function that society used to define and confine women, became their lifeline. Both women were examined by a panel of matrons, older women appointed by the court to verify pregnancy claims. The examination was invasive, humiliating, and public. Both were confirmed pregnant. Mary Read never made it to the gallows. She died in prison on April 28, 1721, likely from fever related to childbirth complications. Her death was recorded in the prison registry with brutal simplicity. Mary read, "Pirate died of fever." No mention of her courage, her skill, her defiance. Just another dead criminal. And Bonny's fate? More mysterious. Some records suggest she also died in prison. Others claim her wealthy father bought her freedom. A few romantic accounts have her escaping and returning to piracy. But the truth is, we don't know. She disappeared from the official record as completely as if she'd never existed. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the most effective punishment wasn't execution. It was erasure. But not every female pirate had the protection of pregnancy. Let me tell you about the ones who faced the full brutality of 18th century justice, starting with a woman whose name history almost forgot. Maria Cobham, Jamaica, 1720s. She should have lived the quiet domestic life expected of a planter's wife. Instead, she murdered her husband with a knife to the throat and fled to the docks. Convinced a crew of desperate men to make her their captain. For 3 years, Maria's ship terrorized merchant vessels throughout the Caribbean. She was known for tactical brilliance and complete ruthlessness. When she captured a ship, she would personally interrogate the captain. If she suspected he was lying about valuables, she'd have him tortured in front of his crew until he talked. But what made Maria truly terrifying? Her treatment of women aboard captured vessels. She showed them no mercy, no sisterly solidarity. Upper-class women who begged for their lives were thrown overboard. Servants and slaves were pressed into service or sold at the next port. She seemed to take particular pleasure in destroying the lives of women who represented the domestic ideal she'd rejected. When Maria was finally captured in 1725, there was no pregnancy to save her. No legal tricks. No last-minute reprieves. She was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death with mechanical efficiency. But her execution was different, in ways that reveal the deep misogyny of the system. Maria's hanging was scheduled for market day in Port Royal. Maximum attendance guaranteed. The authorities wanted every woman in Jamaica to see what happened to females who stepped outside their prescribed roles. Vendors set up stalls around the gallows, selling food and drink to spectators. Children were given the day off from school to witness the spectacle. Before the execution, Maria was subjected to additional humiliations specifically designed for women. She was stripped and publicly examined by a doctor to confirm she wasn't pregnant. A process that was both medically unnecessary and deliberately degrading. Then she was forced to wear a white dress, symbolizing the purity she'd corrupted through her crimes. As Maria was led to the gallows, the crowd's behavior revealed something deeply disturbing about how society viewed female transgression. When male pirates were executed, crowds often showed grudging respect for their courage, their defiance, their refusal to beg for mercy. There was something almost romantic about a pirate captain going to his death with dignity. But with Maria, different. They screamed insults about her appearance, her morality, her failure as a woman. They threw rotten fruit and worse, called her a whore, a devil, an unnatural monster. The hatred wasn't just about her crimes. It was about her audacity in claiming the same freedoms men took for granted. Maria seemed to understand this. According to witness accounts, she spent her final moments delivering a speech that shocked everyone who heard it. Standing on the gallows platform, noose around her neck, she looked out at the crowd. You condemn me not for piracy, but for being a woman who refused to serve men. Every woman here would do what I did if she had the courage. But you don't. You'll go home to your kitchens and your nurseries and pretend that this life of servitude is natural, is right, is God's will. I chose freedom, and I regret nothing. Silence. Even the executioner hesitated. In that moment, Maria had done something far more dangerous than any piracy. She'd articulated the truth that terrified society. She'd named the real crime, being a woman who refused to submit. When the rope finally tightened around her neck, Maria's death wasn't quick. The short drop method used in executions was designed to cause strangulation rather than a broken neck. She dangled there, body convulsing, legs kicking, for what witnesses described as nearly 10 minutes. But here's the part that haunts me. Several witnesses reported that she never stopped staring at the crowd, even as she died. Even as her face turned purple and her eyes bulged. She kept her gaze fixed on the spectators, as if she was memorizing their faces, as if she wanted them to remember this moment forever. After her death, Maria's body was left hanging for 3 days, longer than was typical even for male pirates. Officials wanted to ensure every woman in Jamaica had a chance to see what happened to females who chose violence over submission. But something unexpected happened during those 3 days. Women began gathering beneath the gallows. At first, they came alone or in small groups, standing silently before hurrying away. But as word spread, more came. They brought flowers, small offerings, whispered prayers. The authorities, alarmed by what looked like the beginnings of a shrine, ordered the body cut down and buried in an unmarked grave. But the damage was done. Maria Cobham had become a symbol, a martyr. A reminder that some women would rather die as themselves than live as what others expected them to be. That terrified the government more than any pirate ship ever could. Now let me tell you about a punishment that was perhaps worse than death itself. Public flogging. While execution ended suffering quickly, flogging was designed to break the spirit while keeping the body alive. A continuing reminder of the consequences of defiance. The case that haunts me most is Rachel Schmidt, German woman, found herself aboard a pirate ship in 1719 through circumstances that remain unclear. Some accounts suggest she was fleeing an abusive marriage. Others claim she was escaping religious persecution. What we know for certain, she became one of the most feared members of Edward Lowe's crew, known for her skill with both cutlass and pistol. Rachel was captured during a raid off the American coast. Unlike Anne Bonny and Mary Red, she couldn't claim pregnancy. She was unmarried and had deliberately avoided romantic entanglements that might compromise her position. The authorities in Boston faced a dilemma. Public opinion was divided about executing a woman, even a pirate. There was something about hanging a female that made even hardened men uncomfortable. But they couldn't simply let her go. That would send entirely the wrong message. So they chose a punishment designed to be public, degrading, and painful, but not fatal. 100 lashes with the cat o' nine tails, administered in the town square over 4 days. Let me explain what this meant, because I don't think we truly understand the horror of these floggings. The cat o' nine tails wasn't just a whip, it was an instrument of torture. 9 separate cords, each knotted at intervals, designed to tear flesh with every stroke. A skilled flogger could strip skin from a person's back in a dozen lashes. 100 lashes could easily kill someone, especially if administered all at once. But Rachel's punishment was designed to maximize suffering while keeping her alive. 25 lashes per day for 4 days. Time for wounds to partially heal between sessions. Calculated cruelty. A careful balance between torture and survival. The first day drew a crowd of over 1,000 people. Word had spread throughout Boston and the surrounding countryside that a female pirate was to be publicly whipped. People traveled for miles to witness something that had never been seen before. A woman receiving the same punishment typically reserved for the most hardened male criminals. Rachel was stripped to the waist and tied to a whipping post in Boston Common. The executioner, Thomas Whitmore, had reportedly never whipped a woman before. Witnesses said his hands shook as he raised the cat-o'-nine-tails for the first blow. But if Whitmore was nervous, Rachel showed no fear. According to multiple accounts, she stood straight backed against the post, chin raised, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't ask for mercy. She absorbed each blow in silence, her body jerking with impact, but her spirit apparently unbroken. The crowd's reaction was complex and disturbing. Some spectators were clearly horrified. Several women fainted during the flogging. At least one man was seen vomiting after a particularly vicious blow opened a deep gash across Rachel's shoulder blades. But others seemed to feed off the spectacle. They cheered with each blow, shouted insults and encouragement to the flogger, placed bets on whether Rachel would break before the 25 lashes were complete. The violence brought out something ugly in the crowd, something that revealed the deep anger and fear that female transgression provoked. After the first day's punishment, Rachel was taken to the town jail to have her wounds tended. The doctor who examined her reported that her back was raw meat, with several lashes having cut deep enough to expose bone. He recommended the remaining sessions be postponed until she healed. The magistrates refused. The punishment would continue as scheduled. Day 2 brought an even larger crowd. Word had spread about Rachel's stoicism, her refusal to break. Many people came specifically to see if she would finally cry out, finally beg for mercy. If anything, Rachel seemed even more defiant. When asked if she repented of her crimes, she reportedly spat at the magistrate and said, "I regret only that I was caught." The second flogging was worse than the first. Whitmore, perhaps emboldened by the crowd's enthusiasm or frustrated by Rachel's continued defiance, delivered the blows with increased force. Several reopened wounds from the previous day, causing blood to flow freely down Rachel's back and legs. Still, she didn't cry out. Still, she didn't beg. With each blow that failed to break her, she became more dangerous to the social order they were trying to protect. By the third day, something had changed in the crowd. Where before there had been mostly bloodthirsty enthusiasm, now there was a growing undercurrent of unease. Rachel's refusal to submit, her apparent immunity to pain and humiliation, was starting to look less like punishment and more like martyrdom. Women in particular began to respond differently. Instead of gasping in horror or fainting at the sight of blood, some began to stand straighter. To meet Rachel's eyes when she looked out at the crowd, there was recognition there, identification, a growing sense that this woman's suffering was somehow connected to their own daily struggles with submission and powerlessness. Officials noticed this change too. By the fourth day, they had positioned additional guards around the whipping post, not to protect Rachel, to prevent any attempt by sympathetic spectators to intervene. The final flogging was administered with brutal efficiency. Whitmore, perhaps eager to finish the ugly business, delivered all 25 lashes in quick succession. The cat-o'-nine-tails rising and falling in steady rhythm, while Rachel's blood spattered the ground around the post. When it was over, when Rachel was finally cut down, she collapsed to her knees but immediately tried to stand again. The crowd watched in stunned silence as this broken, bleeding woman attempted to walk away under her own power. Several people stepped forward to help her. She waved them off. According to witnesses, Rachel's final act of defiance was to turn and face the crowd. Her back a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone, and say in a voice loud enough for all to hear, "You can destroy my body, but you cannot touch my soul. And there are other women watching who will remember what you've done here." Rachel Schmidt died 3 days later in the town jail, officially from infection in her wounds, though some whispered that she had simply willed herself to death rather than give the authorities the satisfaction of seeing her submit. But her words proved prophetic. In the months following her flogging, several women in Boston were arrested for seditious talk and encouraging female disobedience. Officials had succeeded in punishing Rachel, but in doing so, they had created something they hadn't expected. A symbol of resistance that would inspire other women to question their own submission. The punishment had backfired. Instead of reinforcing social order, it had revealed the violence that maintained it. That revelation would prove more dangerous than any pirate ship. Before we dive into the stories of disappearance and obliteration, I need to tell you about something that might be even more disturbing than the physical punishments. The systematic destruction of identity. The Empire's officials understood something that modern torture experts know well. Sometimes the most effective way to break someone isn't through pain. It's through the complete annihilation of their sense of self. The mental assault began the moment a female pirate was captured, designed not just to punish the individual woman, but to send a message to every other woman who might be watching, listening, or dreaming of liberty. Consider Isabella Rodriguez, captured off Puerto Rico in 1724. Isabella had been born into Spanish nobility, fled an arranged marriage to join privateers operating under French letters of marque. When the war ended and her letters became worthless, she continued raiding as a full pirate, eventually commanding her own ship and crew. When Isabella was captured, the Crown's men faced a unique challenge. She wasn't just any female pirate. She was nobility, educated, well-connected, articulate. If they simply executed her, she might become a martyr. If they treated her with deference due to her birth, they'd undermine the message they wanted to send about women who stepped outside social boundaries. So they chose a different approach. They stripped away every marker of her identity and status until she became nothing more than a cautionary tale. First, they took her name. In official documents, she was referred to only as the Spanish whore or the pirate woman. Her noble lineage, her education, her accomplishments, all wiped out with bureaucratic efficiency. Next, they took her clothes. Fine garments that marked her status were replaced with rough sackcloth, the kind worn by the lowest class of criminals. Her jewelry was confiscated. Her hair was shorn. Her appearance deliberately degraded to remove any visual markers of dignity or station. Then they took her voice. Isabella was highly educated, spoke several languages fluently, known for her eloquence, her ability to inspire loyalty in crews, her skill at negotiation and command. But in prison, she was forbidden to speak except to answer direct questions from captors. Any attempt at conversation with other prisoners, any effort to maintain habits of command or leadership was met with immediate punishment. The guards were instructed to treat her not as a fallen noble or even as a dangerous criminal, but as a curiosity, a freak show attraction. They would bring visitors to gawk at the woman who thought she could be a pirate captain. They encouraged mockery, degradation, humiliation. They wanted to reduce her from a figure of fear and respect to an object of ridicule. But perhaps the cruelest mind game was the way they distorted her story. Official statements about her case emphasized not her courage, her leadership, or her tactical brilliance, but her unnatural appetites and moral corruption. They suggested that her turn to piracy was the result of sexual deviance, mental illness, or demonic possession. Anything but a rational choice made by a capable woman seeking independence. The trial itself became an exercise in mental demolition. Isabella was forced to stand trial in the same sackcloth garments, her shorn head uncovered, while prosecutors painted her as a cautionary tale about what happened to women who abandoned their natural roles. They brought in former crew members who testified not about her abilities as a captain, but about her alleged masculine behaviors and unnatural desires. The questioning was designed to humiliate as much as to establish guilt. Isabella was asked intimate questions about her sexual history, her relationships with crew members, her monthly cycles. The court claimed these questions were relevant to determining whether she was of sound mind. But their real purpose was to reduce a commanding figure to a collection of biological functions and moral failures. When Isabella tried to defend herself, to speak with the eloquence and intelligence that had once commanded respect from hardened pirates, the court cut her off. They claimed that her unnatural articulateness was further evidence of her corruption, that proper women didn't speak with such authority or confidence. The sentence, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Death by hanging, of course, but delivered in language that emphasized not her crimes, but her failure as a woman. The judge spoke at length about her abandonment of natural feminine virtues, her embrace of masculine vices, her corruption of the sacred bonds of family and society. Isabella's execution was delayed for months, while the Crown's representatives waited for maximum impact. They wanted her to have time to fully absorb the destruction of her identity, to understand that she would die not as Isabella Rodriguez, noble and pirate captain, but as a nameless example of female transgression. During those months in prison, visitors reported that Isabella seemed to shrink, both physically and mentally. The woman who had once commanded ships and men became hesitant, uncertain, broken. The systematic assault on her identity had accomplished what torture and threats could not. It had made her doubt herself, her choices, her very worth as a human being. When she finally walked to the gallows in March 1725, Isabella bore little resemblance to the proud pirate captain who had terrorized Spanish shipping just months before. She was a cautionary tale made flesh, a living demonstration of what happened to women who dared to dream beyond their prescribed boundaries. But even in her broken state, Isabella managed one final act of defiance. As the noose was placed around her neck, she looked out at the crowd and spoke her first words in months. "I was Isabella Rodriguez. I commanded ships and men. I lived free. Remember my name." The crowd fell silent. The Crown's men had succeeded in breaking her body and spirit. But in that final moment, she had reclaimed her identity, her dignity, her right to be remembered as something more than a cautionary tale. It was a small victory, but enough to remind everyone watching that the woman they were executing had once been remarkable, had once chosen dangerous independence over safe submission, had once lived the kind of life that most people could only dream of. That reminder was dangerous enough that the empire's representatives immediately moved to suppress it. Newspaper accounts of the execution made no mention of Isabella's final words. Official records referred only to the execution of a Spanish pirate woman. Her name was once again wiped from the historical record. But the mental warfare hadn't ended with her death. It continued in the way her story was told and retold, twisted and shaped to serve the empire's needs. Isabella Rodriguez, noble and pirate captain, became a cautionary tale about female sexuality, moral corruption, and the dangers of abandoning traditional gender roles. The real Isabella, intelligent, capable, brave enough to choose dangerous autonomy over safe submission, was buried beneath layers of propaganda and distortion. This pattern was repeated with female pirate after female pirate. Their stories were methodically distorted, their identities obliterated, their humanity stripped away until only cautionary tales remained. The empire understood that killing the women wasn't enough. They had to kill the possibility that other women might see them as models, as inspiration, as proof that different choices were possible. The mental torture was ultimately more effective than the physical punishments. Hangings created martyrs. Floggings created sympathy. But the methodical destruction of identity, the reduction of complex human beings to simple moral lessons, the obliteration of female agency and capability, that served the empire's purposes perfectly. It sent a clear message to every woman watching. This is what happens to those who step outside their assigned roles. Not just death, but degradation. Not just execution, but erasure. Not just punishment, but the complete annihilation of the self. And for generations, that message worked. The stories of female pirates became stories about fallen women, moral corruption, and the wages of sin. The real women, brave, capable, complicated human beings who had made extraordinary choices, were lost beneath layers of propaganda and distortion. It's only now, centuries later, that historians are beginning to recover the real stories. To peel back the layers of psychological warfare and discover the remarkable women who were hidden beneath. Women like Isabella Rodriguez, who chose freedom over safety and paid the ultimate price not just with their lives, but with their very identities. Their sacrifice reminds us that the battle for women's freedom has always been fought on multiple fronts, not just for the right to choose different paths, but for the right to be remembered as something more than cautionary tales, to be seen as complex human beings rather than simple moral lessons. Not every captured female pirate faced the drama of a public trial or the spectacle of execution. For many women, especially those of African, indigenous, or mixed-race heritage, capture meant something that was, in many ways, worse than death. Complete obliteration of identity and forced disappearance into systems of exploitation that left no records, no traces, no acknowledgement that they had ever existed as free individuals. Let me tell you about Awilda. That's not her real name. We'll never know that because it was stripped from her, along with everything else that made her human in the eyes of the law. Awilda was a name given to her much later by historians trying to piece together her story from fragments of shipping records and slave inventories. What we know. In 1723, a woman of African descent was among the crew of a pirate ship captured off Charleston. The ship's captain, Samuel Bellamy, not the famous Black Sam, but a lesser-known pirate who had taken his name, had been raiding merchant vessels along the American coast for nearly 2 years. The woman who would be called Awilda was not just a crew member. According to testimony from captured merchants, she was Bellamy's quartermaster, second in command of the ship. She had led boarding parties, commanded during battles, had a reputation for both tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. Some accounts describe her as a former slave who had escaped from a South Carolina plantation and turned to piracy as the only available form of liberty. When Bellamy's ship was captured by Naval Patrol, the white members of the crew were processed according to standard piracy laws. They were imprisoned, tried, and executed with appropriate legal ceremony. But Awilda's fate was entirely different. The Crown's representatives faced a problem. How do you execute someone who, in the eyes of the law, isn't quite human? Slaves and former slaves existed in a legal gray area. They could be punished for crimes, but they couldn't be granted the dignity of a formal trial. They were property, not people. And property couldn't commit piracy. It could only be misused by its owners. So instead of putting Awilda on trial, the authorities simply reclassified her. She was listed in official records not as a pirate, but as stolen property recovered from pirates. Her years of independence, her role as quartermaster, her leadership of one of the most successful pirate crews in the Caribbean, all of it was wiped out with the stroke of a pen. The process was bureaucratic in its cruelty. Awilda was examined by a panel of experts who determined her approximate age, physical condition, and market value. She was classified as prime breeding stock and assessed at 60 pounds sterling, less than the value of the ship's cannon. But here's where the story becomes even more horrifying. No one could determine who owned her. If she had indeed escaped from a plantation, the original owner could claim her as recovered property. But slavery was a paperwork-intensive business. Escaped slaves who had been free for years often had no clear legal ownership. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Awilda was sold at public auction to pay for the costs of her capture and processing. She became property twice, first stolen from her original life, then sold again to pay for her own re-enslavement. The auction took place on the Charleston docks on a Tuesday morning in March 1724. Awilda stood on the auction block in chains, her quartermaster's coat and weapons long since stripped away. Reduced to a commodity to be evaluated by potential buyers who prodded her muscles, examined her teeth, and discussed her potential for field work or breeding. The man who bought her was a rice planter named Jonathan Hartwell, who owned a plantation on the Ashley River. According to his records, which survive in the South Carolina Historical Society, he purchased one Negro wench, age approximately 25, formerly associated with pirates, strong constitution, suitable for field labor, 60 pounds sterling. That entry represents the complete official obliteration of everything Awilda had been. No mention of her leadership, her courage, her years of autonomy. She had been transformed from a pirate quartermaster into one Negro wench in a single line of ledger text. But Awilda's story didn't end with her sale. Plantation records from the Hartwell estate, fragmentary though they are, suggest that she never truly submitted to re-enslavement. Within 6 months of her purchase, she was listed among difficult slaves requiring special supervision. By the following year, she had been moved to a work gang reserved for incorrigible slaves who required constant watching. Other plantation documents hint at a more complex story. Several mentions of work slowdowns and unexplained equipment failures suggest that Awilda may have been organizing resistance among the other enslaved people. There are also references to nighttime disturbances and singing that disturbs the peace, possibly coded communication with other slaves or attempts to maintain some connection to her former life of independence. The final reference to Awilda in the plantation records is both cryptic and chilling. In 1726, 2 years after her purchase, Hartwell's overseer noted, "The pirate woman died of fever, body disposed of in the swamp, good riddance to troublesome property, no burial, no marker, no acknowledgement of a human life ended, just disposed of in the swamp, like broken equipment." But even this obliteration wasn't complete. Because what the authorities hadn't anticipated was that stories have a way of surviving even when the people who lived them don't. In the slave quarters of South Carolina plantations, in the hidden gatherings where enslaved people shared news and maintained connections to their African heritage, the story of the woman pirate captain lived on. She became a figure of legend in the underground networks of enslaved communities. Her name might have been taken away, her official existence destroyed, but her story, transformed, embellished, mythologized, continued to circulate. She became a symbol of the possibility that even the most oppressed could claim independence, even if only temporarily. Generations of enslaved people would hear whispered stories about the woman who commanded a pirate ship, who led men into battle, who lived free on the ocean before being dragged back into chains. In those stories, she wasn't Awilda the property or one Negro wench from a ledger book. She was the pirate queen, the sea witch, the woman who would not bow. The Crown's men thought they had solved the problem of female piracy by destroying her from official history, but they had actually created something more dangerous, a myth that would inspire resistance for generations to come. That myth was built on a foundation of blood, suffering, and the absolute determination of one woman to remain free, even when liberty meant death. But perhaps the cruelest fate awaiting captured female pirates was one that left no dramatic last words, no stirring speeches, no moments of defiant martyrdom. It was a death that came slowly, silently, forgotten in the rotting hulks of prison ships anchored in harbors across the British Empire. These floating prisons were never meant for long-term confinement. They were supposed to be temporary holding facilities, places to keep prisoners until proper trials could be arranged or until space opened up in land-based jails. But as piracy cases overwhelmed courts and prisons filled beyond capacity, temporary became permanent. These ships became floating tombs. Let me paint you a picture of what awaited women in these maritime dungeons. Imagine being chained in the hold of a ship that hasn't moved in years, its hull slowly rotting in the harbor while you rot along with it. The smell hits you first. Human waste, vomit, infection, death, all stewing together in the tropical heat. The air is so thick you can barely breathe. What oxygen exists is shared among dozens of bodies packed into spaces designed for cargo, not people. But it was worse for the women. So much worse. Take the case of the prison ship HMS Success, anchored in Kingston Harbor, Jamaica, in the 1720s. Originally a fourth-rate ship of the line, Success had been decommissioned after sustaining damage in a hurricane and converted into a floating prison for pirates and other enemies of the Crown. The male prisoners were kept in the lower holds, chained to the bulkheads in rows like cargo. The conditions were hellish: rats, disease, starvation, violence. But at least they had the protection of numbers and the rough brotherhood that sometimes develops among men facing shared suffering. The women were kept separately, in what had once been the ship's bread room near the stern, a space perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet. No ventilation except what seeped through the rotting planks above. Into this space, officials packed as many as 15 women at a time. These weren't just pirates. The justice system had a habit of throwing all undesirable women together. Accused witches, political prisoners, women convicted of adultery or other moral crimes, escaped slaves, and yes, the occasional female pirate. They were all considered equally dangerous to social order, equally deserving of disappearance. One of the few detailed accounts of conditions aboard these prison ships comes from the journal of Dr. Henry Sloane, a ship's physician who was occasionally called to treat prisoners when their deaths might prove embarrassing to officials. His descriptions are clinical, matter-of-fact, and absolutely horrifying. Dr. Sloane wrote about visiting the Success in August 1724 to examine a woman he identified only as the Spanish pirate. She had been captured several months earlier as part of a crew operating out of Tortuga, had been waiting in the prison ship for a trial that never came. When Dr. Sloane descended into the women's quarters, he found the Spanish pirate chained to a bulkhead, her legs swollen with infection, her skin covered in sores from rat bites and malnutrition. She was delirious with fever, speaking rapidly in a mixture of Spanish and English, reliving battles and raids that existed now only in her fractured memory. But what struck Dr. Sloane most was that she was still fighting. Even dying, even forgotten, she was still trying to organize the other women, still trying to maintain some semblance of dignity and resistance in that floating hell. She had arranged the women in a defensive formation, with the strongest nearest the entrance to protect the sick. She had organized a system for sharing the meager food rations. She had maintained discipline and hope in a place designed to destroy both. Dr. Sloane's journal entry for that day is chilling in its understated horror. Found the Spanish pirate in advanced stages of ship fever, complicated by malnutrition and infected wounds. Remarkable that she has survived this long given the conditions. More remarkable still that she continues to exercise command over her fellow prisoners. Recommended immediate execution as an act of mercy. Request denied. The Spanish pirate died 3 days later, still chained to that bulkhead, still organizing resistance among women who had nothing left to resist with but their refusal to surrender their humanity completely. But her death wasn't recorded in any official log. Prison ship authorities had learned that detailed records of prisoner deaths invited uncomfortable questions from London about justice in the colonies. Better to let people simply disappear, to fade away without documentation or ceremony. The Spanish pirate's body was dumped overboard at night, weighted with chains, committed to the same sea that had once given her freedom. No marker, no prayers, no acknowledgement that a human being had lived and died. Just another problem solved by the simple expedient of forgetting it had ever existed. Yet even in death, her influence continued. The women she had organized, the discipline she had maintained, the hope she had somehow kept alive in that putrid hold, it all persisted after she was gone. When Dr. Sloane returned to the Success several weeks later, he found that the remaining women had maintained the systems she had established. They were still sharing food, still protecting the weak, still refusing to surrender their dignity even as their bodies wasted away. It was a form of resistance that officials couldn't combat because they couldn't understand it. They could chain bodies, starve flesh, break bones, but they couldn't break the bonds that these forgotten women had formed with each other. In the worst place imaginable, they had created a community, a family, a small republic of the damned that refused to die even when its members did. The Success was finally decommissioned in 1726, not because of humanitarian concerns, but because the hull had rotted so badly that it was in danger of sinking. The surviving prisoners were transferred to other ships or sold as indentured servants. Most had no records of their names, their crimes, or their origins. They had been completely erased from official history. But their stories survived in other ways. Sailors who served on ships anchored near the prison hulks carried tales back to their home ports. Port workers who had seen the bodies dumped overboard whispered the stories in taverns. Even officials, in private letters to friends and family, sometimes let slip details about the horrors they were administering in the name of justice and order. And occasionally, very rarely, someone survived. Someone made it off those rotting ships alive and remembered what they had seen, what they had endured, what they had witnessed in those floating hells. Their testimonies, scattered through maritime records and archives, reveal the truth that officials tried so hard to hide. That the Empire's response to female piracy wasn't just punishment. It was attempted annihilation of the very idea that women could choose violence, could choose freedom, could choose anything other than submission. The prison ships weren't just about punishment. They were about erasure, about making sure that the stories of women who had dared to live as pirates would die with them, forgotten in the dark holds of rotting ships anchored in forgotten harbors. But stories have a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to kill them. The echoes of those floating hells still whisper across the centuries, reminding us of the price that some women paid for daring to dream of freedom. What strikes me most about the fate of female pirates isn't just the cruelty of their punishments. It's how completely their stories were wiped from existence. This wasn't accident. This wasn't oversight. This was a deliberate campaign to make sure that future generations would never know that some women had once commanded ships, led men into battle, and lived completely outside the rules. The process began even before the women were dead. Court records vanished. Ship logs were rewritten. Witness testimonies were edited to minimize what women had actually done in pirate crews. Active participants became passive victims. Leaders became followers. Choices became circumstances. Take the pirate ship Queen Anne's Revenge. Not Blackbeard's famous vessel, but a smaller ship that operated out of Nassau in the early 1720s. Merchant captains who survived attacks described a crew that was roughly one-third female, led by a woman known only as Captain Sarah, who commanded the respect and loyalty of some of the most dangerous pirates in the Caribbean. But here's where it gets sinister. 20 years later, when these events were recorded in official histories, Captain Sarah had been transformed into a camp follower of no particular importance. Her female crew members had become women of ill repute who provided comfort to the pirates. Their leadership, their combat roles, their very existence as independent actors had been written out of history. This distortion served multiple purposes. First, it maintained the fiction that piracy was purely masculine, that women were naturally incapable of the violence and leadership that piracy required. Second, it reinforced the idea that women who associated with pirates were victims or prostitutes, not willing participants. But most importantly, it prevented future women from seeing models of female capability and defiance. If you don't know that women like you once commanded ships and lived free, how can you imagine doing it yourself? The church played a crucial role in this campaign. Priests and ministers often served as both moral authorities and record keepers in their communities. They had strong incentives to minimize or eliminate references to successful female criminals. Their sermons, which were often the only form of historical record for many communities, consistently portrayed captured female pirates as cautionary tales about the wages of sin rather than examples of female capability. I found one particularly telling example in the archives of St. Peter's Church in Charleston. The burial records from 1725 include an entry for a woman of ill fame, lately deceased in prison, buried without ceremony in unconsecrated ground. But marginalia, in another hand, apparently added years later, identifies this woman as formerly a pirate captain of some renown among the criminal class. Someone had deliberately obscured this woman's identity and accomplishments, reducing her from a pirate captain to merely a woman of ill fame. Even in death, even in a church record that no one but clergy would ever see, her story was too dangerous to preserve intact. The legal system participated in this cover-up as well. Courts developed elaborate procedures for handling female pirates that were designed as much to obscure their stories as to punish their crimes. Trials were held in closed sessions. Records were sealed or destroyed. Witnesses were sworn to secrecy. When Mary Read and Anne Bonny were tried in Jamaica, the proceedings were initially public. But after their pregnancy claims created a sensation, the government imposed strict censorship on newspaper coverage. Editors were forbidden from printing details about the women's backgrounds, their roles within the pirate crew, or their statements in court. The result? Contemporaries knew these women existed, but very little about who they actually were or what they had accomplished. They became mysterious figures, more legend than history. And legends can be shaped to serve whatever purposes the storytellers need. By the 1730s, just a decade after the height of female piracy in the Caribbean, it had already become difficult to find accurate information about women who had been notorious throughout the region just years before. Their stories had been absorbed into broader narratives about piracy that emphasized male heroism and female victimization. The few women who were remembered were transformed into archetypes that reinforced, rather than challenged, social norms. Anne Bonny became the tragic lover who turned to crime for romance. Mary Read became the woman forced by circumstances, who disguised herself as a man out of economic necessity. Other female pirates were either forgotten entirely or reduced to footnotes in the stories of their male associates. This pattern wasn't unique to piracy. Throughout history, women who achieved positions of power through means other than marriage or inheritance found their stories systematically minimized or eliminated from official records. Female business owners became merchants' widows. Female political activists became hysterical women. Female military leaders became camp followers. The message was clear. Women might occasionally achieve remarkable things, but those achievements would not be remembered, would not be celebrated, would not serve as inspiration for future generations. Yet despite all these efforts, fragments survived. Scattered references in ship's logs, brief mentions in personal letters, oral traditions preserved in coastal communities, archaeological evidence from shipwrecks. The pieces of women's stories that were too numerous, too widespread, too deeply embedded in the historical record to be completely eliminated. These fragments tell us that female piracy was far more common than official histories suggest. They reveal that women served not just as occasional crew members, but as captains, quartermasters, navigators, and tactical leaders. They show us that the golden age of piracy included a significant number of women who had chosen violence and adventure over submission and security. But perhaps most importantly, These fragments remind us that the stories we think we know about the past are often the stories that those in power wanted us to know. The real history had to be recovered piece by piece, fragment by fragment, from the deliberate attempts to destroy it. The authorities thought they could eliminate the threat of female piracy by eliminating the women themselves. But they understood that killing the women wasn't enough. They had to kill their stories, too. Had to make sure that future generations would never know that such women had existed. They almost succeeded. For centuries, the history of piracy was told as an exclusively male story, a tale of brotherhood and adventure that had no place for women except as victims or prizes. Female pirates became the stuff of legend and romance, not serious historical study. But stories have a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to kill them. In recent decades, historians have begun recovering these lost narratives, piecing together the fragments that survived the campaigns of destruction. What they've found is both inspiring and heartbreaking, evidence of women who refused to accept the limitations their society placed on them, who chose dangerous adventure over safe submission, who lived and died on their own terms even when those terms meant violence, exile, and ultimately, oblivion. These women paid the ultimate price for their choices, but their stories, recovered from the silence that was meant to entomb them forever, remind us that some people have always been willing to pay any price rather than live in chains. Let me tell you about the specific methods they use to break these women. Because the devil, as they say, is in the details. And the details are absolutely horrifying. When Grace O'Malley, the Irish pirate queen, was finally captured by English forces in 1593, she faced something that had never been tried before, a specialized interrogation designed specifically for women who had commanded men. The English understood that traditional torture might create a martyr, but they needed to extract information about her fleet, her allies, her hiding places. So they devised something far more sinister. They brought in her own son. Donald, captured months earlier, was dragged into the interrogation chamber. Not to be tortured himself, that would have been too obvious. Instead, they made Grace watch as they prepared to execute him for piracy, the noose around his neck, the scaffold ready. The crowd gathered. All she had to do was give them the locations of her remaining ships, the names of her captains, the details of her intelligence network. Grace O'Malley had fought English warships. She'd commanded a fleet of 20 vessels. She'd terrorized English shipping for decades. But watching her son prepared for execution, that broke something in her that swords and cannon never could. She talked. She gave them everything they wanted: ship locations, captain names, hidden harbors, supply routes, an entire pirate network dismantled because they understood exactly where to apply pressure. The English kept their bargain. They didn't execute Donald. Instead, they shipped him to a penal colony in the New World, where he died of fever within 6 months. Grace lived another year in an English prison before dying of what the records call a wasting sickness. But those who saw her said she had simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped being anything more than a hollow shell waiting to die. The psychological torture had accomplished what years of naval warfare couldn't. But the English weren't the only ones who developed specialized techniques for female pirates. The Spanish had their own methods. In 1695, Catalina de Erauso, a woman who had lived as a man for over 20 years and commanded pirate crews throughout the Caribbean, was captured by Spanish authorities in Cartagena. The Spanish faced a unique problem. Catalina had been living as a man so successfully that even her own crews didn't know her biological sex. She'd fought duels, visited brothels, even been involved in romantic relationships with women who believed she was male. Her disguise was so complete that it challenged the very foundations of Spanish society's understanding of gender. So they decided to make an example of her that would be remembered for generations. They stripped her publicly in the town square. Not for execution, but for exhibition. For 3 days, Catalina was chained naked to a post, while the townspeople were encouraged to come and gawk at the woman who thought she was a man. Children were brought to see her. Priests delivered sermons about the unnatural corruption of the female form. Artists sketched her humiliation for distribution throughout the Spanish Empire. The goal wasn't just to punish Catalina. It was to create a visual reminder of what happened to women who rejected their assigned roles so completely that they could fool everyone around them. But here's where the Spanish miscalculated. Catalina de Arauso had spent decades perfecting the art of survival. She'd learned to think like a man, fight like a man, command like a man. The psychological techniques that worked on traditionally raised women didn't work on her. On the 3rd day of her exhibition, as the crowd gathered for what they thought would be another day of humiliation, Catalina did something that no one expected. She started laughing. Not the broken laughter of madness, but genuine amusement, as if the entire spectacle was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. "Look at you," she called out to the crowd in a voice that carried across the square. "You're so terrified of what I represent that you have to chain me naked to a post to feel safe. You need an army to guard one woman. You need the entire apparatus of church and state to convince yourselves that I'm the unnatural one." The crowd fell silent. "I've lived as a man for 20 years, she continued. "I've commanded ships, fought battles, earned respect and loyalty. And you? You're so afraid of that possibility that you've turned my punishment into a celebration of your own cowardice." The Spanish authorities, realizing that the exhibition was backfiring spectacularly, cut it short. Catalina was hustled back to prison, where she died under mysterious circumstances just days later. But her final speech had already spread throughout Cartagena. Within weeks, it was being repeated in taverns and market squares across the Spanish Caribbean. The Spanish had succeeded in killing Catalina de Arauso, but they had failed to kill what she represented. Then there were the French methods. The French approach to female pirates was perhaps the most coldly calculating of all. They understood that public executions could create martyrs, and that psychological torture could backfire if the victim proved too resilient. So they developed a system of what they called administrative disappearance. Female pirates captured by French authorities simply vanished from the official record. No trials, no executions, no public spectacles. They were processed through a bureaucratic system designed to erase them as efficiently as possible. The woman would be taken to a French colonial prison. Her name would be removed from all official documents. She would be assigned a number. Her personal possessions would be destroyed. Then she would be put to work in the most dangerous jobs available, cleaning out ship holds infected with plague, handling mercury in mirror-making workshops, testing food for poison. The work was designed to kill slowly and quietly. No drama, no martyrdom, just a gradual wearing away of life until death came as a relief. If questioned, French officials would claim no knowledge of any female pirates. The women had simply never existed. This system was so effective that we only know about it from a handful of documents that survived by accident. Letters from prison chaplains to their superiors, questioning the morality of what they were witnessing. One such letter, from Father Antoine Dubois at Fort Royal in Martinique, describes watching numberless women waste away in service to the colony, their crimes unrecorded, their names unknown, their deaths unremarked. He estimates that over a dozen female pirates passed through his prison between 1720 and 1725. Not one of them survived to see freedom. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves outside the prison walls. No records were kept of their deaths. They had been erased so completely that they might never have existed at all. Except for Father Dubois' guilt-ridden letter, hidden in church archives for 3 centuries, they would have disappeared without a trace. These weren't just punishments. They were experiments in human breaking, carefully designed to find the most effective ways to destroy women who had dared to live outside the boundaries society had set for them. The physical tortures were just the beginning. The real horror was in the precision with which these systems were designed to attack not just the body, but the mind, the spirit, the very sense of self that had allowed these women to choose freedom in the first place. Each empire developed its own methods, but they all shared the same goal: to create punishments so terrible, so complete, so precisely targeted at female transgression, that no other woman would ever dare to follow in their footsteps. They wanted to make the very idea of female piracy impossible to imagine. So here we are, at the end of our journey into the darkest corners of maritime justice. You've heard about the trials that were theater, the executions that were entertainment, the disappearances that were calculated destruction. You've learned about women who chose death over surrender, who fought battles that history tried to forget, who paid prices that were designed not just to end their lives, but to end their stories. But as you lie there in the darkness tonight, I want you to think about something that might haunt your dreams even more than the horrors we've discussed. The silence. The complete and utter silence that surrounds these women in official history. For centuries, if you wanted to learn about piracy, you'd read about Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, Black Bart Roberts, larger-than-life figures whose exploits filled books and inspired legends. But Bonny, Mary Red, the Spanish pirate who died organizing resistance in a prison ship, the nameless quartermaster sold back into slavery, the women who were flogged, hanged, tortured, and disappeared. Silence. Not because they were less remarkable, not because their stories were less dramatic, but because someone, somewhere, decided that their stories were too dangerous to tell. Think about that for a moment. These women terrified the most powerful empires on Earth so completely that those empires spent enormous resources not just killing them, but ensuring that future generations would never know they had existed. The British Empire, which ruled the seas for centuries, was so threatened by Anne Bonny's defiance that they couldn't bear to record her final fate. The Spanish Empire, which conquered most of the New World, was so disturbed by Catalina de Arauso's gender transgression that they had to put her on public display to convince themselves she was real. The French Empire, masters of diplomacy and culture, was so unnerved by female pirates that they developed an entire bureaucratic system designed to make them vanish without a trace. What does that tell you about these women? What does it tell you about the power they represented? These weren't just criminals. They weren't just outlaws. They were living proof that the social order these empires had built was artificial, fragile, maintainable only through constant violence and the threat of violence. Every female pirate who commanded a ship was a demonstration that women were capable of everything men claimed they couldn't do. Every woman who chose violence over submission was proof that the natural order of male dominance was nothing more than organized oppression. Every pirate queen who lived and died on her own terms was a crack in the foundation of an entire worldview. So they had to be eliminated. Not just their bodies, but their examples. Not just their lives, but their possibilities. The authorities understood something that we sometimes forget. Stories matter. Examples inspire. Models of behavior spread like wildfire if they're not carefully controlled. If women saw other women commanding ships, leading men, taking what they wanted by force, they might begin to imagine such lives for themselves. And that possibility was more threatening to the established order than any fleet of pirate ships. So they wrote the women out of history, reduced them to cautionary tales, transformed complex human beings into simple moral lessons. But here's the thing about silence. It's never as complete as those who impose it believe. Fragments survive. Stories leak through. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's been buried under centuries of lies and omissions. The prison ship records that accidentally survived. The church marginalia that revealed more than it concealed. The plantation documents that mentioned the pirate woman in passing. The whispered stories in slave quarters. The legends passed down in coastal communities. The archaeological evidence that can't be rewritten or destroyed. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, the real story has emerged. And what it reveals is both more terrible and more wonderful than anything the official histories ever recorded. More terrible because the punishments were worse, the suffering greater, the destruction more complete than we had imagined. More wonderful because the women themselves were more remarkable, more defiant, more absolutely determined to live free than even their legends suggested. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll be surrounded by silence. But it's not empty silence. It's full of echoes. The echo of Bonny's voice telling Calico Jack that if he'd fought like a man, he wouldn't have died like a dog. The echo of Mary Reed's sword cutting through Caribbean air as she defended her honor in single combat. The echo of Maria Cobham's final speech from the gallows, naming the real crime she was dying for. The echo of Rachel Schmidt's back splitting under the cat-o'-nine-tails while she refused to beg for mercy. The echo of Isabella Rodriguez reclaiming her name and identity in the moments before death. The echo of the Spanish pirate organizing resistance even as she died in chains. The echo of Awilda's story, transformed into legend in the hidden gatherings of enslaved communities. The echo of Grace O'Malley's fleet, scattered to the winds but never truly defeated. These echoes don't speak of victory. Most of these women died badly, painfully, forgotten by the official histories that celebrated their male counterparts. But they speak of something that might be more important than victory. The absolute refusal to surrender. The determination to choose dangerous truth over safe lies. To choose painful authenticity over comfortable conformity. To choose themselves over what the world demanded they become. They chose to live as themselves, completely and without apology, even when the price was everything they had. And that choice echoes still. In every person who refuses to accept that their possibilities are limited by others' expectations. In every individual who chooses dangerous honesty over safe silence. In every human being who looks at the boundaries placed around their life and decides to cross them anyway. The female pirates lost their battles against the empires that destroyed them. But they won something that the empires couldn't take away. They proved that such battles could be fought. They showed that ordinary people could choose extraordinary paths, even when those paths led to extraordinary consequences. They demonstrated that some things, dignity, authenticity, the right to live as yourself, are worth any price, even the ultimate one. Their ships have rotted, their crews have scattered, their bodies have turned to dust. But their defiance survives. In the fragments of stories that no destruction could eliminate, in the legends that grew around their memories, in the inspiration they provide to anyone who has ever felt trapped by others' expectations. Listen carefully tonight. You might hear them. The whisper of wind in rigging that no longer exists. The creak of timber on ships that sailed into legend. The voices of women who refused to be silenced, even by death itself. They're calling across the centuries, reminding us that courage is always possible, that authenticity is always a choice, that some dreams are worth dying for.